Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at authoritarian regimes and specifically how they maintain power. We've got this research paper. It's called Strategies of Political Control and Regime Survival in Autocracies. And I think, given your expertise, this is going to be really fascinating to kind of pick apart.
Yeah, the title alone, it sounds like we're going to get into some pretty deep stuff here.
Yeah, this isn't like an intro to dictatorships.
Yeah.
We're going deep on this. So how do these regimes maintain power? How can we predict their stability? And maybe even identify some of those pressure points where they might be vulnerable.
Yeah, I like where this is going. So what's the focus for the researchers?
Well, they break it down into three main categories: repression, co-optation, and indoctrination.
Mm.
But it's not just a list. They really analyze how these things interact, how the effectiveness changes over time, and even how it impacts the way a regime might collapse.
So it's not just a question of do they use it, but how and when and to what extent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And they actually start by challenging a pretty common assumption about repression. We tend to think of that as kind of the go-to move for autocrats, but they highlight some pretty surprising findings.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What did they find?
So they found that even amongst the most long-lasting autocracies, there's huge variation in how much they actually rely on repression. Like, I'm trying to think of a good example here. Like, a regime that might have lasted for decades but didn't use a lot of overt violence, but really heavily controlled information, that kind of thing. And it kind of suggests that just brute force alone isn't always the key to longevity.
Yeah, that's interesting because it seems to contradict that classic image, the dictator ruling through fear and violence.
Right. There's more to it. It's much more nuanced than that. And even within the category of repression, they make this crucial distinction between two types. So the blatant kind, that targets physical integrity, imprisoning people, torture, disappearances, that kind of thing. And then a more subtle form, where they restrict civil liberties.
Right. So things like freedom of speech, assembly, the press, that kind of thing. Yeah, that can be just as effective at, stifling dissent, especially over time.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that they don't necessarily stick to just one type, right? They can shift between these forms of repression, sometimes even within the same regime.
Yeah.
They adapt based on internal pressures, external pressures.
Makes sense. A smart autocrat wouldn't limit themselves to just one tool in the toolbox.
Right.
They'd adapt to the circumstances. It's almost like a political chameleon. They change colors to blend in.
It's a great analogy. And that's something to keep in mind when we're analyzing these regimes. They're not static. They're learning, they're evolving, they're becoming more sophisticated.
Which makes predicting their behavior, their vulnerabilities, all the more challenging, right?
But I guess speaking of tools in the toolbox, let's move on to this idea of co-optation. How are they approaching that?
Well, they go beyond that simplistic view of co-optation as just bribery or patronage. They're really emphasizing the creation of institutions like legislatures or ruling parties. The idea is to give these key actors, a stake in the system. It's strategic inclusion. You make them feel like they're part of something bigger.
Right. It's like that old saying, keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
Yeah.
You bring your rivals into the fold, you give them a little taste of power, and suddenly they're invested in maintaining the status quo.
Precisely. But here's where it gets interesting. The research really digs into this factor they call opposition party autonomy, meaning how much freedom the opposition parties actually have to operate to challenge the regime.
Exactly. And what they found might surprise you.
Yeah.
The regimes that completely shut down opposition, or are the ones that give them too much freedom, they're actually more likely to collapse. It's about finding that sweet spot of control. Enough to keep them in check, but not so much that they become this rallying point for discontent.
So it's a balancing act. Too much control, you risk creating martyrs. Too little, and you risk getting overthrown. So how do they manage this?
Well, this is where their analysis of institutional co-optation gets really granular. They break it down further and look at whether a legislator even exists in the first place. And then, if it does, how much autonomy do those opposition parties within it actually have?
So it's not just about the facade of democracy, right? It's about the actual mechanisms of power within those institutions. That's a really important distinction and one that I see getting missed a lot when people analyze these regimes.
Absolutely. It highlights the importance of looking beyond the surface level, right? Just because a regime has elections or a parliament doesn't mean it's genuinely democratic.
Yeah.
You need to look at the subtle ways that power is distributed and exercised.
Right. It's about the degree of genuine influence, not just the appearance of it. But I'm also curious about how they address the co-optation of the masses. How do you bring the general population on board?
They tackle that head on with this concept they call coercive distribution. And it's the idea that by providing for citizens' basic needs, things like social welfare programs, subsidized housing, regimes can create a sense of dependence. And that can make people less likely to support any challenges to the system.
Yeah. It's a pretty sophisticated form of control. Instead of just relying on fear or force, you create a system where people rely on the regime for their well-being. And that makes dissent a much riskier proposition.
Exactly. It becomes a matter of survival, not just ideology, you know? And in that context, even small grievances can feel huge if people think they have too much to lose by speaking out.
Yeah. That's a really powerful insight. And it makes me wonder, how does indoctrination fit into all of this? Because, I mean, if you can control the narrative, you can control how people perceive what they stand to gain or lose,
Right.
right?
It's all interconnected. And that's actually where we'll pick things up in the next part of our deep dive. We're going to be exploring how these researchers unpack this often overlooked but incredibly powerful strategy of indoctrination.
Can't wait. I mean, it's clear that these researchers are really approaching this with a level of nuance and depth that you don't see very often. Okay, so indoctrination, it often gets kind of overshadowed by these, more dramatic tactics like repression, but I have a feeling these researchers see this as a pretty key piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, they argue that actually indoctrination, especially when you deploy it strategically over the long term, it can be even more effective than just coercion. It's about shaping hearts and minds, not just controlling bodies.
Yeah, it's the difference between compliance and genuine belief, right? If you can convince people that the regime is legitimate, that their interests are aligned with the autocrat, then you've built a much more stable foundation for power.
Exactly. And they break indoctrination down into two primary arenas. You've got education and maybe not so surprising in this day and age, media.
Yeah, those are both powerful channels for shaping how people see the world, especially if you can, control the information flow. So what did they find specifically?
Well, when it comes to education, they highlight how autocratic regimes will often manipulate curricula to, glorify the regime's history, demonize opponents, and instill this sense of nationalism that's very much tied to the ruling party or the leader. It's like this subtle form of propaganda that starts at a young age, and it can have a really profound impact on how people perceive the world.
It's a long game, isn't it? You're essentially molding the next generation of citizens, ensuring they grow up with this worldview that supports the regime's ideology.
Yeah, it's like addressing dissent before it even has a chance to form.
Pretty chillingly effective if you can pull it off. But what about media? I mean, I would imagine that's even more crucial in today's world, with everyone so hyper connected.
Absolutely. And the research really dives into this. And they focus specifically on the rise of what they call information autocracies, which are regimes that really get the power of controlling the narrative in the digital age.
Yeah.
And they've become incredibly sophisticated in how they use media to manipulate public opinion.
Yeah, that's something I'm grappling with constantly in my own work. The tools, the techniques for spreading propaganda and misinformation they've evolved so rapidly. It's a constant arms race to try to, stay ahead of the curve.
The researchers found that media indoctrination, particularly in these information autocracies, it's actually a really potent predictor of regime survival. They point to the ways that these regimes use censorship, propaganda, even seemingly independent media outlets to just control the flow of information.
It's not just about silencing voices, it's about actively shaping the narrative, creating an echo chamber where people are only exposed to information that reinforces the regime's, their point of view.
And as we've seen, that can be incredibly effective in creating this sense of shared reality, even if that reality is completely distorted or manipulated.
Makes you wonder how you even begin to measure the effectiveness of something like indoctrination. It's so insidious. It's not like you're, counting tanks or measuring economic output.
Yeah, and that's one of the methodological challenges that the researchers address head on. They acknowledge that measuring the impact of indoctrination is complex. It's a long-term process. It's gradual. The effects are subtle, difficult to isolate.
Yeah, it's like trying to measure the impact of, a single drop of ink in the ocean. You know it's there, you know it's having an effect, but to actually try to quantify that impact, incredibly difficult.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean it's not happening or that we shouldn't try to understand it. And to their credit, the researchers use some pretty innovative statistical techniques to try to tease out the impact of indoctrination.
So what did they do?
They use this technique called model stacking. And it's essentially a way of assessing the relative importance of each of these strategies in predicting regime collapse. So it's basically comparing different prediction models, each one focusing on a different strategy, to see, okay, which one is most accurate in forecasting whether a regime is going to fall apart.
Okay, so it's a way of isolating the effects of each strategy, even though in the real world, obviously, they're all kind of intertwined and interacting with each other.
Yeah, exactly. And what they found is, while there are definite patterns, like the link between media indoctrination and regime survival, there's also a lot of variation, a lot of noise.
Right. It makes sense. I mean, these regimes aren't operating in a vacuum. There are so many other factors,
Yeah.
economic conditions, geopolitics, historical legacies. All of that's shaping their choices and ultimately their chances of survival.
Absolutely. And the researchers really emphasize the importance of context in understanding how these strategies play out in different regimes.
So a one-size-fits-all approach to analyzing these regimes it's not going to work. You need to understand the specifics of each case, the nuances of their history, their culture, their political landscape.
Yeah. And this is where their analysis goes beyond just identifying these patterns. They actually delve into the different ways in which regimes break down. And,
Yeah.
and they make some really interesting distinctions between, total collapse versus transitioning to another autocratic form. And then, of course, the holy grail of democratization.
So it's not just about whether an autocracy falls, it's about how it falls. And that can have, huge implications for what comes next.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that certain strategies seem to have different effects on these different outcomes.
Give me an example.
Well, take the restriction of civil liberties. That's actually linked to a lower likelihood of any kind of breakdown, suggesting it's effective for sheer survival, but not necessarily for long-term stability or a smooth transition.
So it might keep the regime afloat in the short term, but it doesn't really address those underlying issues that could lead to, a much more dramatic and chaotic collapse down the line.
Right, precisely. It's
Ah.
it's like putting a bandage on a deep wound. It might stop the bleeding temporarily, but you're not addressing the underlying infection.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And it makes you wonder about, the regimes that really rely heavily on controlling information. Does this research suggest that, genuine democratization is going to be especially challenging in those cases?
Yeah, that's a really crucial question, and one that we'll explore in more detail in the final part of our deep dive. So we were talking about how some of these strategies that autocrats use might actually make it harder for them to become more democratic. Kind of counterintuitive, but the research seems to say that regimes that really clamp down on information, they might have the toughest time making real reforms.
Yeah, it is kind of a sobering thought, isn't it? Because if you've got a population that's been systematically conditioned to accept a certain narrative, to see the world through a lens that the regime has carefully constructed, breaking free from that can be incredibly difficult.
Yeah, it's almost like you're starting a political movement from scratch, but
Yeah.
but you've got this added challenge. You've almost got to deprogram people from years of indoctrination before you
Yeah.
can even start introducing new ideas.
Yeah, it's a huge obstacle. And it requires, I think, a really deep understanding of how indoctrination works, how it operates on individuals, but also on society as a whole.
The researchers highlight this by, they make this distinction between the different types of regime breakdown. And they point out that while restricting civil liberties might be effective at preventing any kind of collapse in the short term, it can actually make a transition to real democracy less likely down the road.
Makes sense. I mean, if the only way you can hold on to power is by, really tightly controlling information and suppressing any kind of dissent, then any meaningful liberalization, that's probably the end of the regime.
Yeah, they're kind of trapped in their own system. Their survival depends on this level of control it's incompatible with genuine democracy.
It's a tragic irony in a way, and I think it underscores the need for really nuanced approaches when we're trying to promote democracy. This one size fits all, it's just not going to work.
And going back to that model stacking they used to figure out which strategies were most linked to regimes falling apart, what do they find?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. Their analysis actually showed that two strategies were consistently the most powerful predictors of regime breakdown. One was restricting civil liberties, and the other, and this was the really big one, was media indoctrination.
So the very things that seem to help these regimes survive in the short term, those might actually be the things that make real democratic change the hardest to achieve.
Yeah, it seems that way. And it really drives home the point that, the fight for freedom, it's not just happening on battlefields or in election booths. It's happening in the minds of people.
Yeah, if you control the narrative, you control how people see reality. And if people believe the regime's narrative, then they're just less likely to challenge it, even if it's not in their best interest.
This brings us back to your area of expertise. Given how powerful this media indoctrination can be, what are the implications of this research for people who are, working to counter misinformation, to promote democratic values, all of that?
Well, I think it highlights the need for really sophisticated, multi-pronged strategies. We need to be as savvy as the autocrats in how we use media and technology, not just to debunk these false narratives, but to offer compelling alternatives.
Yeah. It's about building resilience in individuals, but also in society as a whole, teaching people to think critically about information, to recognize propaganda and manipulation. But it's also about strengthening democratic institutions,
Yeah.
promoting media literacy, making sure there's a real diversity of voices out there in the public square.
We've got to make democracy more than just a system of government. It's got to be a lived experience, a culture of open debate, critical thinking, active participation.
Well said. And this research gives us a really valuable, I think, roadmap for understanding the challenges that we face and the strategies that we need to be developing if we want to overcome them.
It's a call to action, really, not just for us, political strategists, policymakers, but for all of us. If we believe in democracy, we need to be vigilant, we need to be informed, we need to be engaged if we want to protect and strengthen the freedoms that we hold dear.
We can't take democracy for granted. It needs constant nurturing, We have to be critical, we have to be willing to adapt to the changing tactics of those who would try to undermine it.
Well, that's about all the time we have for this deep dive into the world of autocratic control. We've covered a lot today, from those subtle forms of repression to this incredibly pervasive power of indoctrination, and just how important it is to look at the context of each of these regimes.
It's been a fascinating conversation, and I hope it's given our listeners some new insights and things to think about.
A final thought for everyone out there. As we've seen, controlling the narrative, that's crucial for maintaining power, not just in autocracies, but in democracies as well. So the most powerful weapon we have in defending democracy is our own ability to think critically, to question what we're told, and to engage in open and honest dialogue with each other.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.